For those of you who maybe aren't aware, I have a co-writer on this channel. The videos are largely mine, but I have a close friend who checks and contributes to these scripts, and sometimes he'll even take the bulk of a certain game's discussion. Namely, he contributes most of the talking points for the Mega Man games, and wrote basically the entirety of Volume 7. And while I would normally still be the one to narrate his scripts, the video you're about to see is about one of his most formative gaming experiences, and the script he wrote was far too personal to come entirely from my mouth. So please welcome my co-writer who will be tag-teaming this video with me. Tag team? Double team? I don't know. Whichever one sounds more sexual.
When I was 7, my dad got me an SNES. Granted, this was a 97, so it wasn't new hardware by any means. My younger cousin was playing Super Mario 64 badly, at the same time I was playing Yoshi's Island like a pro. But while an older system at that point, the SNES jump-started my love and mild obsession with video gaming. And while it wasn't the first game I ever played, that's coming later, the first game I ever bought for myself was Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past. I'd played mostly platformers and admittedly bad licensed games up to this point, ripped to family video, so this was my first foray into the adventure side of gaming, and I immediately fell in love with this game, this series, and ultimately what video games could and would become.
Development for Link to the Past started in 1988 as a third Zelda title for the NES. But with the Super Nintendo on the way, Nintendo decided to push the new Zelda title to the new console the next year. This allowed for a lot more content to be put into the upgraded cartridge, which was necessary with all the plans Miyamoto had for the newest entry, including a scrapped concept for Link to be part of an adventuring party with a magic user and a female fairy. Development went smoothly with no notable issues. Or at least we can assume so. Nintendo tends to keep a lot of their behind-the-scenes info under heavy lock and key, so really who knows. And after 2 years of fine-tuning, Link to the Past released in Japan on November 21st, 1991, the Super Nintendo's first anniversary, and released stateside the following April. A Link to the Past actually serves as a prequel to the first two Zelda games, taking place centuries before. The game's Attract mode explains the tale of the 7 wise men who sealed evil into the Dark World long ago, and now Hyrule's royal advisor, the wizard Aghanim, has turned against the kingdom and murdered the king, while trapping 6 maidens, descendants of the wise men, in the Dark World to weaken the powers keeping the evil sealed away. The 7th maiden, Princess Zelda, manages to telepathically call for help to anyone it may reach, and a young boy named Link and his nameless uncle are the ones to hear it. The older man insists Link stay home, but the boy disobeys and follows him to Hyrule Castle, only to find his uncle slain. Taking sword in hand, Link saves Zelda and the two enlist the help of the local priest, who sends Link on a quest for 3 pendants that will allow him to obtain the Master Sword, the weapon able to stop Aghanim. However, upon Aghanim's supposed defeat, he manages to entrap Zelda at last, as well as banish Link to the Dark World. Throughout his adventure, Link will need to jump back and forth between the worlds of light and dark, and rescue the 7 maidens in order to defeat Aghanim for good, as well as the true evil mastermind behind the wizard, the King of Darkness, Ganon. Having learned their lesson from Zelda 2, Link to the Past is back to being an overhead adventure game. You still enter dungeons, solve puzzles, beat bosses, get more health and items, and so on. The use of magic was brought over from Zelda 2, so it did do something beneficial for the series.
Besides Dark Link.
Yeah, but the core gameplay of the original game has been greatly expanded upon. Diagonal movement has been implemented, and with the help of specific items, Link can quickly dash forward with his sword drawn, or swim through deep bodies of water. He can also jump off of ledges and fall down pits or wells for more exploration options. This version of Link is more practiced sword fighter as well, probably thanks to his late uncle, as he now attacks with a rapid horizontal slash instead of a forward stab. What's more, by holding the attack button, Link can charge energy and unleash a spin attack that deals double damage and hits in every direction around him. He now has to wait until obtaining the Master Sword before firing sword beams at full health, but the beam has become a ring of energy, so it too has a wider attack range. Arrows have been separated from rupees, which is a shame given the upgraded wallet size, and the map actually shows distinct geographical locations and will have your next objective marked at all times. Meaning it's a functional map now, as opposed to the useless gray block of the first game. And while magic has returned, it has been implemented differently than Zelda 2. Link doesn't cast spells, but instead certain items he wields draw upon his magic meter to activate, from a simple lantern to the sealed medallions and their screen-wide attacks. And with the power of the Super Nintendo and Mode 7, new environmental effects were added as well, like fog throughout the Lost Woods and the thunderstorm flashing effects in the Dark World version of Death Mountain. All the sprites are crisp and detailed, and Link is certainly expressive in this entry, with his hat being animated as he walks and runs around, his face turning red when pulling on objects, or sweating when pushing things. They do nothing for actual gameplay, but they build the immersion. The link the player has to Link, to put it simply. It's easy to forget nowadays, but Link to the Past visually was basically the Wind Waker of its day. I mean, just look at these trees. They'd be right at home in the Minish Cap. The most notable gameplay addition, though, is the ability to go between parallel worlds, if the name of the game didn't give it away. Differences between the two range from subtle to blatant, with plenty of puzzles needing you to warp at certain portals in the light world, or use the magic mirror in the dark world to get to specific areas. Living beings also transform between the two worlds, as enemies in the dark world are significantly more powerful than their light world counterparts, and any of those poor souls that enter the dark world will be forcibly transmogrified into a form indicative of their true nature. Narratively, this was also probably meant to explain the origins of Ganon himself, who until now had simply been some sort of magical beast or monster, but here is explicitly said to have once been human, implying the pig-like form is a reflection of Ganondorf's heart.
Now Link does get an item in the Tower of Hera to prevent permanent polymorphing, but before he obtains that, his Dark World form, his true nature, is revealed to be that of a pink rabbit, which I prefer to the wolf Link from Twilight Princess honestly, at least conceptually. Wolves are really overdone in fantasy fiction, but that's neither here nor there. Speaking of pink, while Link's hair is clearly pink in-game, the manual shows Link with blonde hair as would become his default. Why pink? No one really knows for sure. Programming bug tends to be the accepted answer, with something wrong with the Bunny Link palette being the accused culprit, but if you look closely, they're not the same shade of pink, which implies pink hair as a deliberate choice for the main color palette. There are fan mods of the game that restore the intended blonde or brown hair color, but I'm rambling, pink hair is great. Between Bunny Link and the fairy spell from Zelda 2, Nintendo was already setting up a tendency for Link to be able to transform into a myriad of other beings, which will become much more relevant in later entries. The advanced capabilities of the SNES allowed for having two overworlds, but even that feat is simpler than expected on a technical level. The Dark World exists as merely an overlay of the Light World with different textures, removing the need for two duplicate maps within the files. And that left lots of space to add stuff into the worlds themselves, because every inch of both regions has something new to discover. Nothing feels superfluous or empty in either realm, and in this age of open world gaming where said worlds can get quite desolate and monotonous, this almost feels like a lost art. I can say that as a kid, I was so excited when I beat Aghanim for the first time and was forced into the Dark World, because it meant I got to explore the world again. And once you've entered the Dark World proper and cleared the Dark Temple, the game opens up significantly, both worlds ripe for exploring. The time spent between dungeons can often feel more rewarding than the time spent conquering them.
And speaking of dungeons, this game has a staggering 13 dungeons in total. 12 if you decide to count the two sections of Hyrule Castle as a single dungeon. As opposed to the NES entries, the dungeons have also been adjusted to be more puzzle-based rather than combat-based, as well as being multi-floored, with some dungeons having up to 8 floors or basements, and even utilizing mechanics involving moving between floors, for better or for worse. And for the most part, the dungeons are designed well, and the addition of verticality to the equation really changes everything, with almost every dungeon requiring clever traversal between floors to solve puzzles, and a handful of them being literal towers. They do progress in difficulty as you advance, which is expected, and finding items hidden in either of the overworlds may be needed to progress, like the spell medallions needed to open the Misery Mire and Turtle Rock dungeons. And after the first Maiden Dungeon, the next 3 can be done in any order. The 4th Maiden Dungeon's hidden item unlocks the next 2, and the 6th Dungeon's hidden item is required for the 7th and final Maiden Dungeon. This potential for non-linear exploration is sorely missed in the later entries, excluding Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom for obvious reasons. But even here, the potential dungeon routes have been limited somewhat from the amount of combinations from the NES original, where dungeons could basically be done in any order if you really wanted. This slightly more rigid and defined dungeon order is done in the name of the dungeons themselves being much more structured and tightly designed. Zelda 1 typically assumed that if you were able to find a dungeon, you would have what it takes to clear it, and those dungeons were typically just random assortments of enemy mobs and locked doors mad-libbed onto a grid. But most dungeons in Link to the Past focus on using specific items to progress, and the bosses usually follow the same pattern. For example, the boss of the Swamp Palace is Argus, a giant cycloptic jellyfish covered in smaller argi. You are given the hookshot in the Swamp Palace, which is able to grapple small objects at a distance. Therefore, the game nudges you to use that item to strip the living shields off the boss to uncover its vulnerable eye and defeat it. A simple design, but effective. Not all the bosses follow this design though, because dungeon items can also include equipment, such as stronger armor or other protective items, like the aforementioned Moon Pearl. And in those instances, the bosses are more generic in their weaknesses, usually just requiring sword strikes to a specific location. Notably, the dungeons also have more story significance than the previous games, containing either the pendants needed to attain the Master Sword, or one of the 7 trapped maidens needed to dispel the barrier surrounding Ganon's tower.
However, there are 3 dungeons that have been burned into my childhood memory for being awful experiences, at least for a 7-year-old. The first is the aforementioned Tower of Hera, all because of the boss Moldorm. You encounter this accursed worm on a platform suspended midair above the floor below, with no walls to prevent Link from falling off an edge. And should this happen, upon making your way back to the boss arena from the floors below, the Moldorm's health will have been restored. Even worse is that if you're unlucky enough to fall through the hole in the middle rather than the edges, you'll be sent plummeting down several floors at once. And what is Moldorm's method of attack, you may ask? Why, it acts as a bumper or a spring designed to knock you away on contact if you don't hit the tip of its tail precisely. This is not a hard fight by any means, but the erratic movement patterns and the speed boost Moldorm gains when at a third of its health can drag this fight out unnecessarily. The fact that you fight this thing again in a smaller arena in Ganon's Tower only adds to my exasperation. It is not a difficult boss in either encounter, but the potential to reset the fight multiple times makes it uniquely unpleasant. The second instance of my childhood aggravation, and probably the most infamous part of the game if I'm honest, is the Ice Palace. This entire dungeon is a descent down to the basement to fight the boss. Unlike the Tower of Hera, you want to fall here. Combat also is an issue because most enemies can be bested with fire magic, including the boss, and if you did the dungeons in order, you'll have the Fire Rod or even the hidden Bombos medallion for a fiery screen nuke. No, what makes this dungeon infamous are the ice physics in which Link loses all of his traction and slides an egregious, almost comical distance when trying to come to a stop, and the block puzzle in which you have to manipulate color switches and push a block to the floor below to activate a pressure switch. The problem with this puzzle is the sheer amount of backtracking and extra rooms you have to navigate just to get to the other side of this one specific room. As a 7-year-old, this took me longer than I care to recall to solve. But instead of doing this obnoxious ice puzzle, you could just do the Misery Mire dungeon before the Ice Palace. And here's why non-linear design is great. With the dungeon item obtained in the mire, you can make a block out of magic, thereby activating the floor switch as soon as you find it and then drop down to the boss in the next room. I wouldn't recommend doing this if you're the type of gamer who needs 100% completion on all of your maps, but definitely on subsequent playthroughs. And fittingly enough, the last dungeon I'd like to highlight is Turtle Rock, because if you're not prepared for this one, good luck. This dungeon eats your magic like nothing else, just latches on and drains it from Link like a Mana Metroid. Once again, the cane of Samaria found in the mire is used to get through, but you also have to light torches while you ride on the platforms the cane creates. What's more, the torches don't stay lit, so you have to hit them at specific times during your platform ride in order to activate doors. Sahasrara will suggest you stock up on magic potions beforehand, but if you haven't gotten the magic meter upgrade and or don't have all 4 bottles, which are all optional, filled with green or blue potions, you can quite easily run out of magic. Additionally, the boss requires both the Fire Rod and Ice Rod to defeat, both of which naturally consume magic, and the Ice Rod has also been entirely optional up to this point. Granted, you can obtain it before even entering the Desert Palace, and you should, it's really useful. But still, I distinctly remember leaving, buying more magic potions, and returning to Turtle Rock several times before I could figure everything out as a child, and being frustrated at the waste of time and rupees. It just feels like a late game resource sink, rather than rewarding the player for solving puzzles well. More trial and error than logic. But not all the dungeons are constructed with such spite. A dungeon I do feel is well designed, though far from the only one, is the Thieves' Town dungeon in the Dark World. It starts with a layered maze full of optional treasure chests and traps, before giving you the big key. Once you clear the maze, you can get to the boss arena quite early, but said room is devoid of anything. No boss, no maiden, just an empty room. While exploring more of the dungeon, Link can come across sunbeams shining onto a cracked section of floor above the arena, and with a bomb toss, that will allow the sunlight to enter the boss's room. And finally, after traversing the dungeon's basement and clearing out the jail cells within, Link finds the missing maiden, who isn't trapped in a crystal prison, and who refuses to leave the dungeon should you escort her to the entrance. Upon telepathic urging by Princess Zelda, if you take the maiden to the rays of sunlight pouring into the boss room, the maiden will turn into her true form of Blind the Thief, who had already been established as a character who terrorized Kakariko Village years ago. So not only does the dungeon have a puzzle that spans its entirety, but it also forces you to find the boss, who was a pre-established character that further builds on the lore of the game, since this is the only instance of a boss being someone from the Light World turned into a monster in the Dark World, despite the game saying this happened several times. Besides Ganon, he's a special case. We finally get some show to pair with the tell. This style of dungeon has been used again in later entries, but very rarely, which makes this first inclusion all the more memorable.
Most of the now common Zelda design policies started with or were refined by Link to the Past. The Master Sword was introduced in this entry, which has since become Link's most iconic weapon, and the spin attack was also permanently added to Link's moveset. Other staples of Link's arsenal introduced in Link to the Past include the Mirror Shield, Hook Shot, empty bottles, the ability to swim, and even something resembling the later entry's magic armor. Heart containers in the overworld were replaced with pieces of heart, each one being a quarter of a full container. And dungeons also added the boss key, required to obtain before accessing the boss of that dungeon, although needing the boss key to unlock the item hidden in a dungeon did not return after this, which is fine. It's just extra steps, really. Parallel overworlds quickly became a series staple after this game, to the point where it's easier to list the Zelda titles that don't feature some sort of parallel world, as well as story elements like the Seven Sages, and locations such as Kakariko Village and Lake Hylia. Several established enemies made their debut here as well, like the Hinox, Beamos, and even the Kukos in their Revenge Strike.
Look at all those chickens!
Even the rupee system was expanded upon, with Link's wallet being upgraded to 999 capacity from the start. And Link to the Past would start the Zelda tradition of drowning the player in more rupees than they know what to do with, being able to find rupees, along with hearts and magic, in grass, pots, rocks, and the like, and the addition of new rupee types like red and the precursors for purple, silver, and gold. If you know what you're doing, it's entirely possible to have your wallet well more than half full by the end of the first dungeon.
And while I'm speaking of Zelda designs that originated in Link to the Past, let's briefly touch on the music. Koji Kondo is front and center, as has been the norm for Nintendo's first-party music, and while the overworld theme was reused and updated from the original game, several iconic tracks like Zelda's Lullaby, Ganondorf's theme, fairy cave. Hyrule Castle, and Kakariko Village debuted in Link to the Past, and continue to be used even now across the series. Not only that, but the Dark World uses its own music tracks as well, which I wish would see some more love besides a few being included in Smash Bros. Hidden Mountain and Forest is one of those songs where I can hear it and immediately be hit with a flood of nostalgia.
I'll also chime in here to say that I think it's really cool that the Dark World Overworld theme is basically just the Light World Overworld theme, but in a minor key. I just think that's kind of neat.
One of the most well-known secrets in the game, if not the most well-known, is the Chris Houlihan room, a room containing a message from the eponymous Chris, as well as 45 blue rupees. The reason he's mentioned in this game is because he was one of many who found and photographed Warmech, the elusive super monster from the original Final Fantasy, for a contest being run by Nintendo Power in 1990. As such, Chris's name only appears in the American version, albeit allegedly, because there's yet to be any actual confirmation of Chris, or anyone for that matter, winning the contest from Nintendo Power. Even stranger, this room is a crash prevention measure. If the game doesn't know where to send Link during a loading screen, it will send him to the Houlihan room, which then has Link appear at his house in the Light World upon exiting. Which just seems like an odd place to put a contestant winner's name, if I'm being honest. But given that this was over 3 decades ago, it's doubtful we'll ever receive resolution. So, to my co-writer, that's where your double Warmech prize is. Allegedly.
Oh, I'm sorry. Did they put a room in the game that had my name in it? No, they didn't. So I still did not receive a prize for running into Warmech twice in the same trip. And no, I'm never going to let this go. Much like other Nintendo-released games of the era, there was quite a bit of censorship put upon Link to the Past. Starting with the title, which was originally Triforce of the Gods. And honestly, Link to the Past doesn't even really reflect the actual plot of the game, but I guess the American localizers just couldn't resist the pun. 2 puns, actually, both the main character's name in the title and the allusion to the game being a prequel. Within the game, we see altered content in the form of things like the Sanctuary, very clearly being a stereotypical Christian chapel, but with all of the overt religious elements removed. Aghanim was also originally a priest claiming to be sent by the gods, but he quickly became a wizard and any mention of the divine was completely ignored. Yeah, there's no way early 90s America, right at the peak of satanic panic, was ever gonna sign off on a game where your main objective is to kill a priest. But this censorship was only applied to the text of the game, as seen with Link praying complete with making the sign of the cross to open the way to the desert palace. To avoid the need to censor Zelda entries after this, Nintendo would avoid real-life religious references, instead opting to create their own fictitious faith system complete with a triumvirate of goddesses.
To say that Link to the Past was a success is a vast understatement. With sales of 4.61 million, this puts it in the upper tier of both SNES games and Zelda titles. And it would get a spiritual successor and distant sequel more than 2 decades afterwards with A Link Between Worlds. It was the best-selling game in Japan when it was released in 1991, impressively so because it was released in November, but its North American release the following year was outclassed by a little unknown game called Street Fighter II. Don't know if you've heard of it. Link to the Past has also been ported several times, from the GBA to several virtual console shops, and even the SNES Classic and Switch. Much like how Super Mario World distilled what made the previous entries great and further perfected the formula, Link to the Past did the same for the Zelda franchise, and the SNES wouldn't stop with those two pillars of Nintendo history. Moreover, it also established the formula Zelda games would adhere to for close to 2 decades, and in many ways represents the very quintessence of Zelda. This is easily my favorite Zelda game, and will likely hold that distinction because of the impact it had on me as a child. I got lost in a story I didn't know video games could tell, and I'm so glad I did. This wasn't just a game to play for me, it was a world I could escape to. 2 of them, in fact.
There is one more game from 1991 to talk about before we move on. Yes, my list of games has reached another holiday season during the late 80s to early 90s, which of course can only mean one thing. Another Mega Man game! Wow, how exciting! Mega Man had a fairly solid trilogy of games so far, and we've moved on from the NES into the 16-bit era of gaming. Surely the first Super Nintendo Mega Man entry is upon us, along with all the great advances and refinements that would entail. Well, no, it's another NES game. Now, this wasn't terribly uncommon practice back then. Nintendo made efforts to keep the NES somewhat relevant even into the SNES era, but as you might expect, most of the truly impressive projects would move on to 16 bits, and what was left behind was typically low budget. And Mega Man 4 is one example. Assets are once again reused from the first 3 games, rearranged into new stages, but with otherwise no real changes to the formula. Same old, same old. Mega Man can now charge up his standard buster for a wider and more powerful shot, and he gets a couple new items like the balloon and wire upgrades. There's a new ally character named Eddie who can be located in certain stages, and provides Mega Man with energy or weapon ammo. The game also introduces a new villain, Dr. Cossack, another rival to Dr. Light, who feels he isn't given the recognition he deserves and so creates his own robot masters to destroy him and Mega Man. But by the end, it's revealed that he was acting under duress because Wily kidnapped his daughter, and we just end up fighting Wily in the end anyway. 8 robot masters, they're all weak to a different weapon, yada yada, you know how this works by now. Yeah, with the classic Mega Man series, Capcom really took an if it ain't broke, don't fix it approach to the extreme. Mega Man 4 looks just like the first 3, and plays just like the first 3. The Robot Master weapons are all fine, the music is all fine, the level design is all fine, it's just fine. I couldn't help but notice that 2 different levels use the same gimmick of riding moving enemies over spiked floors or pits, and it's just a bit odd that they would use that particular gimmick more than once. Classic Mega Man games just tend to keep their stage gimmicks confined to just one stage. Like, Gutsman has the collapsible platforms, Quickman has his instant death lasers, Top Man has cats, so it's weird to me that they would repeat the same gimmick more than once in the same game. That's not really like them, but it's not really much of a complaint, more of an observation. But that's really neither here nor there, the game is fine. So, sorry for the shorter review on this one, but there's really nothing to say here. Not every game on my list is going to be interesting enough to be its own entire segment, and unfortunately, that's the case here. And how do you think I feel? I recorded this whole ass game for footage to use, and the script only ended up being 3 paragraphs.